Greetings, my friends. Brother from Harlem back. The subject that I want to talk about right now was an epidemic that was going on in Harlem during my day. Now, the epidemic that we hear about today is the drug problem in America. But we had an epidemic going on in Harlem back in my day and before my day. It was called heroin. Heroin was a narcotic drug that was fed into the Harlem community, and it was controlled for a long while by the mafia. Now, why am I saying this? Because I'm going to tell you the effect that it took. When The Godfather 1 was made back in 1972, there's a scene in that movie where you see the heads of the families, of the mafia families, sitting around a round table with Don Corleone, and the subject of narcotics, bringing it into America, was brought up and fought. He fought him back and forth about this thing called narcotics. He didn't want it in America because this heroin thing would eventually, he said, we don't want it in our schools or our neighborhood. They finally convinced him, don't worry about it, Don Corleone. We will keep it in Harlem, feed it to the coloreds, and we can control them because they're animals. That scene is in The Godfather 1 movie. That scene where they talked about bringing this heroin narcotic into the country. He was opposed to it because he said it eventually get back to us. They convinced him, no, we can control it. Well, they didn't control it. They controlled it for a while. Now, my family moved to Harlem in 1954. I didn't know anything about drugs, narcotics, as they wanted to call it. All I know was there was a bunch of people in an epidemic stage all over Harlem in my day. Now, it eventually got into the Bronx and Brooklyn and everywhere, but it started in Harlem, and the movie tells us that we're going to control it by giving it to the coloreds because we're animals. Now, that's in the movie. So I'm going to assume that that's how the drugs got in this country because they control shipping, gambling, prostitution. The mafia controlled all of that because they had judges and police, everybody, as they say, in their pocket. Now, here we are in Harlem getting an illegal substance that is fed to us through them, mind you, through them because of the profit. They talked in the movie about how much profit they could make. Well, I want to tell you about what I saw when I moved there in the 50s because we didn't have cocaine back then in Harlem. Now, I'm quite sure cocaine was in America. We didn't have marijuana back then. The marijuana started filtering into Harlem when the war broke out, Vietnam, because everybody was telling you about how much pot they were smoking or how much marijuana they were smoking from there. So I'm just going to say that the only drug we had back then was narcotics, heroin. What was heroin? A substance that they cooked down and they injected it into their bodies. I saw tracks running up and down drug addicts' legs. I saw tracks on their legs. They had a thing that, they use a phrase called Elephantitis. I saw people living in my building. You had to step over them to get in the building. Living in my building where an arm would be swollen up as big as somebody's thigh, and their ankle, from their ankle to their knee, would be that wide, and it'd be scaly and scabbed up from them scratching on it. Now, let's talk about that scratching. You could walk down any street in Harlem when I was growing up And you see guys scratching. They be scratching all over. I heard one of them say, the bugs got me. He said, it feels like bugs are crawling over. So they be scratching. Well, they scratched their sores and whatnot. They blistered. They became scaly. Oh, it was a horrible sight. They didn't want to call it an epidemic. I'm talking about the federal government. Oh no, there was just a little problem that they got in Harlem. There were junkies everywhere, everywhere. My best friend, Jimmy P, got strung out on drugs. I think he was 14 or 15 years old. He got strung out on drugs. Had druggies in my family. Everybody had somebody, seemed like, that had a junkie in their family. They would steal from you to feed their habits. And you don't call that an epidemic? It wasn't until the heroin started to get into their neighborhood. How did it get into their neighborhood? All my life living in Harlem, I'd see the white boys coming into Harlem. What you coming in Harlem for? Coming in, they go straight to, they used to call him the candy man, to get that heroin. And then they drive back to their little suburbs. That's how I got into their neighborhood. But where did they put it? In Harlem. Narcotics, heroin. But now, all these drugs that everybody's hung out on now it's an epidemic. What happened to all the ODs? And there was a lot of them. Seemed like every day, every night, everywhere in Harlem, somebody was ODing. I'm telling you, somebody was always ODing. Now, like I say, we didn't bring the drugs into our neighborhood. The mafia started, they controlled it to then. How do I know? I had mafia clients, white boys. Oh yes, I did, okay? But I stayed, like I say, out of the picture. We just made clothes for them. Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. I had mafia clients back then. Like I say, one of them I knew his name. The rest I would just see them out there. Because he was like the little liaison, because he was young and smooth and whatnot. Oh, I'd see him sitting out in their black, because they drove Lincolns. We drove Cadillacs, and they drove Lincolns back then. I'd see him sitting in the car. You understand? They didn't have all the so-called real tinted window back then, so you could see in them. I'd see them there all the time. They control the drugs. Now, how do I know they were the mafia? Because one of them approached me about trying to make a hookup with one of my clients who I knew. Oh yes, oh yes. Narcotics, heroin. Let's not fool ourselves about this big epidemic now. Oh yes, it's big and it's terrible. But we had an epidemic back in my day. It was called heroin. It's something to see all of these guys in the winter standing around a litter can, a little trash can with fire going on, trying to stay warm. You could go to certain streets and on all four corners there'd be a trash can lit up and all these junkies waiting for the candy man to show up so they could get their drugs. Epidemic. But they didn't call it that. Then they finally thought they were going to resolve it. Once it got into their community, into the white community, they come up with a new substance called methadone. So guys, they were switching guys off of heroin into methadone. They were still strung out. So let's not call this epidemic that we got such a horrible thing in America. Because I got news for you. In the black communities in my day, that same horrible thing was going on. They were ODing from this drug called heroin. So I want you guys to know, this epidemic didn't just start. It started way back when. We didn't bring the drugs in here, just like we don't control them now. But when you see that with your own eyes, when you see how it was destroying the black communities, and they kind of pushed it off to the side because it was the black community, it was only when it got into the white community that they thought they had a problem, and they tried to solve it with another substance. So let's think about epidemics and when they started or who had the first one. Now, I'm not that big on all the history of what went wrong in America, but I saw that with my own eyes. I witnessed it. Like I say, I had a family member who got strung out, stole from us, family, to support his habit. I know the effects of what heroin did to my people back then. So I can understand, and I have sympathy and empathy with what's going on in this pill world that they're in. And they still have heroin now. Heroin didn't never go away. It's just, in those days, they fed it to people of color, and they controlled us, because that's exactly what they did. So once again, the brother from Harlem coming to you with a story that he knows and he witnessed, called heroin, or as the street boys said, heroin. That's what we called it. So y'all be blessed, and I'll be back.